Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Biosecurity Now, Predicting Risk and Preventing Outbreaks. I'm Jack Hughes and I'll be guiding you through the next hour. It's great to have you here for what promises to be an insightful and engagement discussion. We'll get started in just a moment, allowing a few more seconds for attendees to join. All right, it looks like most of our attendees are here, so let's dive in. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll explore the latest AI outbreak data and seasonal trends, frontline observations and practical steps producers can take to reduce risk before disease breaches the sheds. This session connects real-world experience with practical biosecurity solutions, informed by national surveillance and applied field epidemiology. A few housekeeping points before we begin. This session is being recorded and will be shared with all attendees afterwards. Everyone is muted to ensure a smooth experience. If you have any questions, please do submit them via the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your question and hit send, and we'll answer them as many as possible at the end. So I'd like to introduce the panel. Let's meet our speakers for today. We have Gary Ford, Head of Strategy and Producer Engagement at BFREPA. Gary has spent his career supporting agriculture, including 19 years at the NFU and as Chief Executive of the BEIC. He is now at BFREPA. He focuses on helping producers succeed and supports members across the sector. We also have Richard Hepple, Veterinary Advisor and Field Epidemiology Lead APHA. Richard is a veterinary epidemiologist with extensive field experience in exotic and notifiable diseases, including avian influenza, FMD, and blue tongue. He works closely with the UK and international partners to support outbreak investigations, preparedness, and training, helping ensure robust animal health and disease control. We have Julian Sparrey, our Group Technical Director here at Livetec Systems, an agricultural engineer with over 30 years experience. Julian co-founded Livetec in 2010. He's been instrumental in advancing high welfare livestock disease control, biosecurity and contingency planning across the poultry sector. We also have Dr. Paul Talling, Biosecurity Advisor here at Livetec Systems. He's passionate about animal welfare, biosecurity and sustainable farming. Paul combines practical farm experience with academic expertise, including a PhD in lecturing in agriculture. At Livetec, he works closely with farmers and stakeholders to implement practical biosecurity strategies that protect businesses and improve farm resilience. So let's get started. I'd like to hand over to Julian, who's going to take us through the latest avian influenza outbreak data. He'll highlight patterns that have surprised us this season, seasonal trends and emerging risk factors, and what that data tells us about predicting disease pressure. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Julian.
Thank you very much, Jack, and good morning to all of you. Welcome to the webinar. When we start looking at the seasonal trends of avian influenza now in the UK, we still get that winter high peak season, but I think now these days we need to be aware of avian influenza all year round. If you look at the graph on the screen, you can see we have the seasonal peaks across the winter, although they come at different times, and maybe that's due to when birds migrate, when disease challenges come into the country, when viruses change. But it's difficult to predict at the moment. But we do know then through January, February, March, like we're in now, we get a continual tail of outbreaks. And so far in this season from October, we've had about 93 outbreaks, and they've continued at a level of 3 or 4 a week in the first part of this year, which is similar to other years. And you can see that the first 3 months of the year, we're always getting these outbreaks. But what really is interesting is the summer months, when we would have expected disease to completely peter out. But we've seen some startling cases through June, July, and August, and in particular cases in August. We've been seeing, in some years 7 or 10 cases in August. And what does that tell us about what's going to happen next? Well, sometimes we think, well, that's going to show a really early season, it's going to go. But for instance, this year we had a few cases in August, and then it petered out towards a ramp up in November. So it is quite difficult to predict, but one thing we do know is it is there all year round now, and it's not something we can just push to one end of the year and forget about. It's something that we have to be aware of, all year round. And if we look at the species affected, it's very similar. It's laying hens, it's turkeys. Unusually, we're getting it in broiler breeders. Maybe Richard and Paul will talk a bit later in the webinar about why we are seeing cases in birds that are supposedly in more higher biosecure areas. So apart from the commercial cases, which is up on the screen there, we're also seeing continual outbreaks in wild birds, and the wild birds are potentially driving that infection pressure into the country. So although wild bird cases have dropped off a little bit from the beginning of this year, we're down to about 30 or 40 cases a week. I think the last 2 weeks it's dropped down to about 20. But we're expecting, these are the outbreaks here. These are the outbreaks that we currently have. And in fact, although we only did this map a couple of days ago, some of these zones have now been closed. So we are seeing the closure of zones. We're not seeing many new outbreaks or any new outbreaks at the moment. But we can't let our guard down, because we know that there is, on the laws of average, March, we tend to get quite a few cases in. And so we should not be surprised to get a few more cases in March. But as I said, we've had about 90 odd cases so far this season from October. If we go to the wild bird picture, in January, I think we've got a picture of wild birds coverage. You can see wild birds were found with, these are positive cases, tested positive for avian influenza. They've all pretty much been, certainly in January, H5N1. We get the occasional H5N5, and they seem to come from Iceland area and Scandinavian areas, but mostly H5N1. And the birds that are mostly picked up are around, there's a lot of geese, grey-lag geese, pink-footed geese, obviously swans, because they're really visible. I think there was something about swans found in London just this week, but those birds are really visible. One thing we don't really know, and I think some of the investigations now are, what part do smaller passerines play in this role? Your smaller birds that might be feeding around your sheds, because if they are dying, we probably don't see them because they're small. The smallest sparrow dropping in the street, that sort of thing, we don't see it. We see the larger birds when we're collecting, when dead wild birds have been collected. Interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, we did pick up, a couple of wood pigeons were picked up as well. That's a bit of a departure from normal, and we're waiting to see what the epidemiology and what the genotype of that was, and why those pigeons were, particularly wood pigeons, they were affected. So we're getting this continual pressure of wild birds, and you can see also across in the Netherlands and Belgium in the Low Countries that there are considerable cases out there. And there's a EFSA website called Bird Flu Radar, and on a weekly basis they predict the probability of introduction of avian influenza into wild birds. And at the moment, the probability in the Netherlands and Belgium is still very high. In some places, 100% likely. There's it's not so high in the UK, in England, lower in Scotland and Wales. It all seems to be across the east of England that we have a high probability. But it says that viral pressure is still going to be there. And we know from some live bird tracking data that we gather that gull species in particular on the coast of the Netherlands and Belgium fly in and out of the UK on a regular basis. They will fly across to East Anglia, they will fly in to the Midlands and back out again at different times of year. We're coming into the breeding season for them, so they will start aggregating on the Dutch coast and the Belgian coast. We also have breeding colonies up on the east coast of Scotland. So these birds will now all come together in these breeding colonies, and then by May they will start breaking out again and flying quite considerable distances, up to 300 kilometers, to their foraging and feeding grounds and the places they stay for the better part of the year. But at the moment, they're beginning to move back to their breeding grounds. So these are carriers as well of disease, and they're mixing with other birds. So we really need to look at this. And one of the things we want to start doing is better predicting how these different effects are interacting. So we know there are wild birds coming in. We know the genotype is changing. We've had seasons where we've had very high seabird mortality in the summer, and that was due to a change in the genotype of the virus. It's changed once again. So things like geese are not as affected in this last season, commercial geese, whereas they have been in previous seasons. So we need to be watching this genotype of not just the birds that are dying, but the actual genotype of the H5N1 virus that they're carrying. Now, if we can map all these things, along with the weather, along with wild bird outbreaks, then we might be able to get a better handle on when these seasonal peaks are coming. So we go back to that original graph. Why is that big seasonal peak sometimes in October, sometimes in November, sometimes in December? What's driving those changes? What's driving the continuance of the virus through the summer? So all we can say, the most that we can say now, is that this virus is an all year round risk, and we should never drop our guard. We need to be on top of our biosecurity, and all the things that the guys will talk about later in this webinar need to be on top of it all year round. So I think that is as much as I have to say on the subject. So I will pass back to Jack, who will introduce Gary and Richard, I believe, for the next part of the webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Julian. For overview and insight into this season's AI outbreaks and trends. It's really powerful when it's visualized in such a way, and how we can work with data. So now I'd like to welcome Gary and Richard, who will share their insights on biosecurity, risk management, and what the sector is seeing this season. And I'd like to start with yourself, Gary. So welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, very, very pleased to be involved. Thank you.
Wonderful. So just to start us off, I mean, you work with BFREPA and you work across the sector, and from your view, you know, is biosecurity still seen primarily as a compliance exercise, or do you see that mindset starting to shift within the industry?
Great question, Jack. I believe, in my observations, conversations I've had with individual producers, that mind shift definitely has taken place, because of the greater awareness of the threat posed by not just avian influenza but other poultry diseases. I think producers get it now. It's moved beyond that compliance code of practice assurance scheme, tick box exercise, and producers do get it. They do understand it. And I think, some of that is down to poultry discussion groups that many producers go to. It's down to conferences. It's down to trade press. It's down to webinars like this, of course, and our excellent private vets out in the field, all repeating that message of the importance of biosecurity is the number one way of keeping your birds disease free. So that is my view. That is my observation, Jack, that the industry absolutely has experienced this cultural shift, it might be termed, and see this disease as for the risk it is, and what they need to do in terms of reducing the probability of the disease on their farm, and at the same time making their business more resilient. So I absolutely, we're in a different space to where we were in previous years, and partly not only the things that I've mentioned about private vets and trade press, etc., getting the message across, but the sheer number of cases that we've had that Julian just ran through, and we know we had 28 cases in my sector, 28 cases on layer farms in the 2025 calendar year. So there's much greater awareness now around the disease and what individual farmers need to do to minimize the risk to their business.
And I think you nailed it there, Gary. the need for biosecurity isn't just around avian influenza as we're speaking around today, it's the other challenges which are present on farms. And I think that awareness has become greater with producers. The better the biosecurity, hopefully the better the production, so the more profitable the business can be. But from yourself, where does policy requirements and assurance schemes still clash, with the on-farm realities? What assurance schemes are asking for versus actually the realities on farms? How do we make it fit?
Yeah, I think that the danger in the past has been that assurance policy has been made potentially in a vacuum, sat behind a desk, far from the realities of running a poultry farm. And as we know, there's an awful lot of moving parts when it comes to running a poultry farm. So I think the guidance, the assurance, the policy has become much more practical and achievable, stretching, but it's stretching for a reason. And I think one example I would give is that APHA, particularly Richard Hepple on this call, was instrumental in working with the BIC to produce the various biosecurity zones that formed part of the line code of practice. So I think that's a really good example of where industry and government have come together to create a document that is practical and is achieving that goal of minimizing the risk of disease incursion on farm.
Yeah. And as you say, not one shoe fits all. All these sites are different size farms, different size sheds. So to meet up with assurance schemes, it is possible. It's just how do we manage that across different types of farms, from barn to free range to broiler to all these different sectors. And given the current strong market, particularly in the egg market at the minute, how should producers, particularly over the summertime now and hopefully during this slowing period, how should they approach investing in biosecurity over the next 6 months, let's say?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jack. I think this is an ongoing process. It should be happening all of the time because it is a priority, or it should be a priority. And as we talked about a changing culture a few moments ago, so it needs to be looked at all of the time. What can I do to improve the biosecurity on my farm? And there are various tools and people out there and businesses out there that can help producers identify where the pinch points are. And that's based on partly what they've seen on other farms, particularly where there's been disease breakdown, but also looking at it through a fresh pair of eyes, because sometimes when we're familiar with our own setup, our own farm, we don't always see the obvious that other people, visitors, see when they come onto the farm. So I would absolutely recommend that producers engage with their private vet over this. They engage with Livetec, with yourself, to give them professional advice on what can be done based on experience on their particular setting. But in terms of what they can, in terms of changes on the farm, for me, it is about putting in designated biosecurity facilities and ample space for that. So, where you change your clothing and put your protective PPE on, having a designated area and plenty of space to be able to do that. We mustn't forget concrete. We know it is expensive, not least in certain parts of the country, the HS2 effect, which has been talked about in the past. Cost of concrete is expensive, but there's no better material to put around a shed to keep the right conditions, to keep that ground dry and well drained. So please look at investing in concrete and in appropriate places. And one area that we know has been a potential source of disease, and I'm sure Richard will talk about this in more detail shortly, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but rainwater. How are we collecting that rainwater? Are the gutters clean? Are they well maintained? Do the downpipes fit into the soakaway that goes into the ground, or have they been knocked? Are they not going into that that hole in the ground, but they're sort of spilling over the concrete and potentially getting through the dwarf wall, or even under the double door? So I think absolutely there needs to be focus on that roof water. How is that being escorted off the premises and not being a source of risk of disease transmission? And I'm a big advocate as well for when you first arrive on farm, setting the right tone for your visitors. And those visitors, could be the egg collector, driver, it could be the feed delivery, it could be your vet, assurance scheme, etc., etc. We all know the range of visitors we get on farm. So get a decent security gate where it's not always difficult to retrofit. And I do appreciate that sometimes I talk as if this is an ideal world, and the reality is it isn't. But I would strongly recommend a decent barrier, an infection control barrier as well as part of that. So typically a 6-meter sliding gate or similar, and then an infection control barrier immediately behind it. So you're setting the right tone, you're setting that culture. This is what we expect of our visitors visiting our farm. So you're setting that tone straight away, and you're then not only you're securing the premises, but when vehicles go through, you've got that infection control barrier. The person doesn't have to get out of their vehicle and go around with a sprayer to disinfect their wheels. It's happening automatically. And I know it costs money, but you mentioned a few moments ago, Jack, about the, thankfully profitability has returned to the sector. Typically these units, circa £25,000, but they do a good job. And this for me is definitely an appropriate price to be paying when it comes to minimizing the risk of disease incursion into your flock and onto your farm, as well as setting that cultural tone for what you expect your visitors to adhere to. So a few things there, just in summary from me, if I may, Jack. Reach out to industry experts, and also think about what practical things you can be doing on your farm along the lines that I just listed out a moment ago.
No, that's great, Gary, and I think you knocked the nail on the head there. There's a lot of powerful information there, and the insightful. We know farming is a busy industry, and farmers are busy, producers are busy, and having that second pair of eyes to come in and notice things what maybe as a producer or a manager you may walk past and say, well, I'll do that tomorrow, then becomes a week later or a month later. And I think some of these to be highlighted by a third party, either by like ourselves or vets especially, is to bring that to the forefront of producers' minds, because these little things do matter. And as you say, security barriers, setting that tone from day one as you walk onto that farm is paramount for anybody. But just to move on before we go to Richard, I mean, there's a large amount of training out there in biosecurity, and there's a lot of companies advising on biosecurity. But is the current biosecurity training available to farmers? What you've seen, is it sufficient to give confidence and ensure effective implementation, or is that still seen as a tick box exercise?
I think we're well blessed in the poultry sector that we have got businesses and assurance scheme, very dominant assurance scheme, and dominant in terms of the number of producers that are part of the line code of practice, and that stipulates that training is absolutely a key part of the scheme. And we've got line training passport to deliver that as delivered by Poltech, and we've got the poultry passport in the red meat sector to satisfy the red tractor assurance scheme. So I think we've got a really good framework there that we can all work within, and professionalizing our industry. I think we cannot do enough in that space. So I think we're well served in terms of the infrastructure, those delivery bodies, the assurance schemes mandating training, and we do need to focus a lot on training, because it's upskilling people that, you know, either an owner or people that work on the farm, and including casual staff. It's upskilling them, because they all need to be part of the solution. The solution here being minimizing the risk of disease incursion. So I think that framework is great. Have we got enough courses? We can never, within reason, we can never have enough choice. But I think the principle for me is that any training courses have to be practical. They shouldn't necessarily be just sat behind a desk playing a video for 20 minutes, because I don't think that's a very effective way of imparting information. So I think the initiative that Livetec, if I can call Livetec out positively, to say that the course that they've pulled together is an excellent resource. It really brings it to life. It's practical, it's engaging, and we've got to do all of those things if we're going to be effective in training people that work in our sector.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Gary. And you know, as we and the industry expands to bring CPD courses in for the likes of visitors and feed delivery drivers and pest control, you know, we all have to work together to minimise, you know, disease entry. And as long as everybody's educated, you know, we keep moving forward. And as I say, every day is a school day, and things do change. So the more we can keep learning, the better it is for everybody within the industry.
Absolutely, and this is definitely something as well that the industry is looking at through the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway. We've set up a working group which is led by industry, chaired by Mike Tyers, looking at how those individuals coming to farm, what can we do to raise awareness with all of them, and leave no stone unturned when it comes to engaging with individuals that visit farm, and making them aware of what their responsibilities are when they're visiting a poultry farm. So there is rightly so, there's an awful lot happening in this space at this moment in time, and that is definitely an area that we need to continue to focus on as we look to mitigate the risk of avian influenza and other diseases.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your insightful discussion there, Gary. And I'd like to now move over to Richard and welcome Richard to the webinar. Welcome, Richard. We might be having a little bit of technical difficulty. Are you there, Richard? It looks like Richard.
If I may say, Jack, whilst
Yep.
Richard's sorting his technical difficulties out, Richard has been very good at sharing with industry images taken from IPs as a learning tool. That is a great asset when it comes to sharing those images, because images speak 1,000 words, as we all know, and is a really good way of conveying good practice or areas that need to be improved upon. And Richard, as I say, has been sharing images with industry through the Poultry Health and Welfare Group to really impart that information, raise awareness. And I think those are powerful images and really do raise the profile and partly covers off one of the first questions you asked me around, you know, how aware are industry to the pinch points and you know, making this a practical implemented way of making change on farm.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So you're back, Richard. Are you with us? I think you may be having some technical difficulties there. I mean, I'll open this up to everybody in this call. I mean, and I'll probably put this over to yourself, Gary, if you don't mind. I mean, you know, how have you seen disease impact outcomes differ between farms and having clear plans versus reacting in crisis?
Yeah, I think the key word there for me, Jack, is stress. It's a hugely stressful experience for for all concerned, or everyone involved in it, because farmers don't want, they don't want to be in a situation where they're presiding over dead and diseased birds. So stress is a big concern at the outset or during a disease outbreak. And the feedback I've had, particularly so from James Baxter, who's been through this wretched experience a couple of years ago, he had plans in place which went a long way to minimize and mitigate that stress. He knew, he had policies in place. He knew and hoped it wouldn't happen, but he knew what he would have to do, what was expected of him if he became the IP. So I think this disease preparedness in terms of knowing what the next steps are, and indeed industry are just talking to, or DEFRA are putting together a document with industry input around what happens, what step by step, if you're suspected of being an IP in infected premise, what to expect in terms of the response from APHA. And that document, I think, is being finalised at this moment in time and should shortly be available. Richard may be able to comment on that. But I think that's a really great document because it gives an insight to producers and certainly raises awareness of what to expect if they were in this difficult position as being confirmed as an IP. So that raising awareness does help tremendously when it comes to everything that's involved in and unfolds when you're an infected premise.
I think you're right there, Gary. We're better to be prepared than not prepared in this industry. And as Julian's touched on earlier, this virus isn't going away. It's here, and whether we see that continue throughout this year is yet to be unknown. But to be for myself, to every producer who may be listening now, is to be better prepared than not, because when this does hit, as you mentioned with the likes of James Baxter, it makes that transition smoother. Unfortunately, when you are in infected premises, that mindfulness of that situation really needs to be there, and we can't talk too much about the mental strain on that time of when it does happen, and our mental health as farmers and producers is a real key thing in this time, and having somebody or something to lean on during them times is paramount, because it's a real hard time for everybody involved.
Absolutely, Jack. And one thing that we've been doing over the last few years is buddying up. So the farm that gets that is the IP, we've been putting them in touch with other farmers who have gone through the same experience, so that other farmer can talk to them on their level and explain to them what to expect next. And that buddying up, as I call it, I think has been very well received, and we've had some really good feedback. And I think that is an example of industry self-help. We look after each other, we support each other through these difficult times. So I think that is one way that we can all cope if we become the IP, which is a difficult situation for all concerned.
No, of course, and I think that's a fantastic thing that BFREPA are doing in allowing and getting producers to talk to each other, because there's nothing better than to talk to somebody. So I'll back that.
I think, Jack, it used to be, sorry if I may say, because 10 pre-2014, before we had the case in Nafferton, November 2014, we've gone many years without avian influenza, and then for 2014, 15, and 16, we had a couple of cases, 2 or 3 cases each year. And because of that, I think there was a bit of a stigma attached to it. But we've had many, many more cases. And as Julian said, we've had 90 plus cases in this season alone since the 1st of October 2025. So that stigma has largely gone away. But it's still a feeling of guilt, I think, a feeling there is some stigma as a person at the IP as a farmer at the infected premise feel. So that's something that we need to, or a reason why we need to support farmers through this wretched situation.
No, of course. Has Richard joined back? No, I think we're having technical difficulties with Richard. So I'd like to move on to Dr. Paul Tallon, if that's okay. And I'd like to thank you, Gary, for your insights there. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to pass over to Paul, who will walk us through why disease potentially gets into sheds, where he will be introducing our version of what we call the Swiss cheese model to explain the most common entry routes. So I'd like to pass over to yourself, Paul.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everybody. This little talk that I'm going to do here is a little bit more practical in some ways, and it's very much based on what we of Livetec see when we go on to infected premises and when we go on to neighbouring farms or other farms. So the title of the presentation is Barriers to Entry, Why Disease Gets In. But actually what I'd like to say, where does it get in? All right, what are we interested in? Gary's been very good. He was talking about keeping it off the farm and everything. But actually, for a bird to get bird flu, the virus actually needs to get to it. And therefore, in these days of housing orders, it actually has to get into the shed. So what I'm actually going to concentrate on today is how it actually gets to the bird, because there's a big emphasis a lot of times in a lot of things about overall biosecurity, but at the end of the day, what we need to remember is the virus getting to the bird. So if we're looking at spending a lot of money, and it's where maybe I'd conflict with Gary a little bit there, is sometimes we need to look much harder at where the bird is rather than its surroundings. And I'll go into that a little bit more. Also, again, when for the bird flu virus, we don't, and Richard would have done on this, you don't actually need very much virus to cause an outbreak. Effectively, you only need enough virus to infect one bird. That bird itself will do the rest then. It will multiply in that bird and away you go. And I know Richard would have told us that basically one wild bird drop-in, there's probably tens of thousands of infectious doses within one bird drop-in. So actually you don't need very much. As many of you will be aware, one of Livetec's roles is as the culling company for the government. We come in and we will cull birds on an infected premises. Obviously not a nice job, but actually it puts us in a very unique position where we're in situ on farm immediately after an outbreak or during an outbreak. And to be honest with you, because our employees, our contractors care, and they care about the farm and they care about what's going on, we regularly get feedback from them on their observations. And most of what I'm going to tell you now is basically what we get feedback and what we've seen with our own eyes. Unfortunately, and it's not a criticism of the government, Richard's not here, so he can't defend himself, but most of the epidemiology reports that you'll ever see from an outbreak will conclude that the outbreak was caused by an indirect contact with an infected wild bird. Now, that is 100% true, and there's no reason to argue with that, and it's probably what's most happened this time. However, that's not a lot of use to the person on the ground, because how has that infected bird got anywhere near your birds to infect them? So what we're going to do is just very quickly, because we haven't got a lot of time, is to just look into the routes into a shed. And you'll see there's a few routes on the map there. One of the things that this season has shown up is that the actual the outbreaks have been quite random. Yes, they've followed similar patterns before, but which farms they take and things and where they're happening has been quite random. We haven't seen massive farm to farm to farm to farm outbreaks like we did in 22. They tend to be quite sporadic and quite isolated, which actually leads very much into the fact that the most likely cause is, again, infected wild birds. They're flying around, they're deciding where to land, and that's actually, if you're unlucky, and I'll use the word unlucky, enough to have an infected wild bird land in your yard, then potentially you're going to have an issue. And again, different areas where there's more wild birds, that disease pressure will build up. Unfortunately, again, we have very little control over where these wild birds fly. All right, we have very little control of where they land, or where they defecate and things like that. So it is, again, it's why I come back to, we need to look at what we can control to a large extent. If we accept that we're going to get pathogens, avian influenza virus, onto our farm, regardless of all the things we put in place to stop it coming onto the farm, if that bird lands on that roof and defecates on that roof and it enters your water system, on your guttering system, there's little you can do about that. But what you can do is actually stop that virus getting inside the building. So again, I'm not denigrating what Gary said about the protection and the emphasis on biosecurity at the farm gate. But unfortunately, as we've seen, that won't stop the virus getting in. We've gone on to plenty of sites this year where the biosecurity has been very good, and yet it's still got in. But actually, when we start looking a little bit harder, there are some small issues. So the routes in that we've got, and Richard would have talked about these as well, is there's 3 routes I've identified there: vermin, water, which Gary talked about, and unfortunately human activity, human behaviour. Some of the more astute amongst you will notice there is potentially another route in, which is air, through the air. All right, I'm going to be controversial here and knock that theory completely on the head. If we look at our experience, and it's very anecdotal, this year we've had, in past years, we have had infected barns on units where adjacent barns within 20 or 30 feet do not get infected. This year we've had farms within 200 or 300 meters of another farm that's infected not get infected. We've had one particular farm where I think there was 8, he was in the middle, and about 8 farms all around him were infected, and they were cleaned out, mucked out, everything, and he's never actually got it into his unit. That's not just luck. That's telling me that the air theory is not a very good one. And to be honest with you, when we look at everybody that we look at, normally one of the other 3, the vermin, water, or human, is a much more logical answer when we actually look at things. So if we look at these little ones in detail now, the first one will be vermin. And this is where I'm introducing our little Swiss cheese model. Again, what we talk about in Livetec, we talk about real life. All right, we don't talk about aspirations. We don't talk about what we think should be there. We actually talk about what is there. And the Swiss cheese model is very good because what it does, it says there's lots of layers to biosecurity. And again, you start in the perimeter and you gradually work onto your farm. And as Gary talked about, we have different zones. We have perimeters, we have general area, we have intermediate areas going into sheds, and then we have the live bird area. In every area, there is a barrier, some sort of barrier, whether it's physical or behavioral or whatever. But interestingly, we can go onto every single site, and somewhere there will be little holes in those chinks. There will be chinks in the armor on every single unit we go onto. The idea is that you don't line those holes up. If the holes don't line up or they're not big enough, the actual virus won't pass. So if we look at vermin, again, we can have mice and rats and birds there. Again, birds not such a big issue these days because everybody's meshed. Everybody is meshing, everybody understands those. But as Jules rightly said, there is some evidence now that maybe little wagtails and things like that may be involved in spreading disease from one area to the other. So hopefully we're not going to have to go to a smaller mesh, but we'll see. From the point of view of vermin, again, the whole point of the vermin going into a shed, it's nothing to do with the vermin actually having bird flu themselves. All right. And what you'll see is the three things that I've put up there, the vermin, the water, and the humans, they all interact as well. I've chased numerous rats across yards. I've seen all the slap marks on holes where their dirty tails bang on holes. Rats and mice, or rats especially, they will, if there's dirty water outside of a shed or mud and it's been infected with feces or something like that, they will physically carry it in on their feet, on their tails, on their bodies. I also, and it's something that Richard and that have started to look at as well, and we have actually sent recently, we've sent quite a lot of mice from sites that we've been things to see whether when the rats drink water, they drink dirty water, that then logically to me that passes through the rat and goes out the other side with little change. If there's virus in that water, that is a very effective way of getting the virus into a building. I believe some of the results from the mice actually show that there is virus inside the what do you call it, the not the respiratory one, the food tract all the way through. So they have found that there is actually virus up its bottom basically, and therefore it is actually maybe able to shed things out. So actually, from the point of view of vermin, allowing vermin to get into your building is a real no-no. And again, when we're looking at spending money on buildings and things, really look hard at proofing, because you've got to keep these things out, because the potential of them walking it in, again, they don't know how to use foot dips or anything like that. So we're there. The three pictures there, just little examples. The first picture is of a door which has been bitten through, so it's just straightforward access to any vermin going straight into the shed. Again, very difficult, but actually there should be some renewal of things there, just basic maintenance. The middle picture is there's a dead mouse in the middle of there. One of the things we've done this year as a company with the APHA is most of our culling has been done with whole house gassing. Now, it is a very effective way of killing a lot of birds very quickly, but also if there's anything else in those buildings, such as vermin, it is a very effective way of destroying them as well. And that was we had about 15 or 16 dead mice in the anteroom after that building had been gassed. And that was on a farm where we were categorically told there wasn't a vermin problem. All right. The final picture one there is a very interesting one. I said we don't normally have issues with birds. Just to show something can go wrong, there is a seagull in the bottom of that IPPC rated fan. How it got in there, we're not 100% sure, but there possibly was an issue with the baffles in the van, in the thing, that weren't well maintained. They were dirty and they were stuck open. So actually, from a building point of view, maintenance of building and making sure everything works really well is really, really important. If we go on to the next one, water, which again is implicated a lot of times. The virus will last a very long time and it's stable in cold water. It's possibly up to 100 days in water at 4 degrees. All right. So those puddles outside your sheds, that bird may have defecated in that shed in December, all right, in the height of the thing. You're in February, March, potentially that water's still infected. So every time somebody drives through it, every time somebody walks through it, you have the potential of carrying that virus somewhere else. I've identified three things there: roof water, surface water is basically rainwater or water's on the surface. It's not necessarily there all the time. Just remember as well, water can go uphill when it's blown, and quite a few in previous years of where we've had big storms where actually the wind and the rain has been blowing and actually the outside concrete or the hardcore has been blown clean with water, but actually it's blown right under the door of the shed and into the shed. Again, puddles, potholes are a real nightmare. They just persistently carry a lot of water in them, all right, which can be infected. Again, water doesn't need much of a route in. It will go through very, very small gaps, and it will take whatever it's got with it. Just a few examples there. There's a side, it's not even an access door. It's on the first picture there, it's not an access door. It's just an emergency escape door. Puddles of water outside there. There was the bedding inside there was soaking. All right, real issue. The middle one is a really interesting one. The farmer's trying really hard. He's got a contractor to put a whole load of new concrete down, as Gary recommended there. But actually, I think there must have been an apprentice doing that one, because he worked out that the actual drain holes needed to be higher than what the actual concrete was. So in the end, he ended up with big puddles in between his drains, and that's a real problem. I believe he actually asked him to come back and fix it. The final one there, again, Gary talked about leaking gutters and maintenance of gutters. There's a pigeon on that roof, just if you notice in the top corner. That pigeon defecating on that roof will infect that whole gutter. I think from the colour of the wall there, you can see what's perhaps in the gutter. That's a proper viral soup. So anything in there is going to live. If there's a virus in there, it's going to live, it's going to thrive, it's probably going to multiply. All right. That water is leaking out of that gutter. Unfortunately, these are very old sheds built on a concrete plinth with concrete blocks. There is a small puddle of water outside, but actually it doesn't go out, it gets sucked into the shed. Basically, the basic principle that the bedding and the shed is drier inside, you've got osmotic potential there, it sucks that water in, and obviously it's going to suck everything in that is with it as well. Finally, the one that nobody likes to talk about, because we all do it properly, is the human aspect. Do we walk it in? The number of times when we've gone and say, where's the virus started? Well, it's just started inside the door. There you go. It's very obvious how it's got in there somehow. So on these human things, it's what PPE you wear, what boot changes you do, if you do boot changes, how you do them, and then human behavior. We still haven't got over, and again, sometimes in the egg industry, mother-in-law comes and mother-in-law comes for that Saturday morning to collect some eggs because that helps you out. But she doesn't like changing her boots, so she just wears her normal clothes in, and that's fine. So things like that, it's human behavior. Why is she any different? And we've got a few, just cognizant of time here, just a few examples. If you look on the left-hand side, I can't tell whether there's a clean or a dirty side to that barrier. All right, there's mucky, it's horrible. It's obviously never going to work. All right. Again, the adage that you can't disinfect muck, it just won't work. So as soon as something becomes mucky, it's not going to work. The middle picture there, a bit more of a modern dwarf wall type of step over barrier. But because nobody's bothered to put any drainage holes in the actual barrier system, they've cut holes in the dwarf wall, which basically let any infection or any pathogens go from one bit to the other. So actually completely ineffective for moving for a disease issue. Also, putting your boots on the wall or things on the wall, all you're doing is facilitating cross-contamination between different areas. So again, a lot of these things don't take a lot of money. They just need thought, and they need time, and they need just thinking about. The final one, which I'll come to, is a really interesting one. It's actually quite a clever way of, they wanted to disinfect their feet, but they didn't want a wet disinfectant in there before they go into the shed. So he's used hydrated lime. Brilliant, quite effective. But when I went along, and again, it's that second pair of eyes that we've all talked about there, I found lots of white footmarks outside of the barrier. Now, if the barrier is working properly, there should be no white footmarks outside the barrier. But again, this one came down again to what we've also talked about, which is education. The member of staff who, you'll notice in the barrier, if you look closely, there's a pair of clogs. And the member of staff wore those pair of clogs in the egg room. But he decided, because he thought best, that the best place for them was in this side of the barrier, which technically is the dirty side of the barrier, because nobody had told him any different. All right. And that's why I found lots of footmarks all the way across the thing. So obviously that barrier wasn't working either, because we could bring disease out of the shed into the others. With that one, I'll leave it there, and I think there's maybe time for a few questions.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. Very insightful. So for one last time, I'd like to see if Richard's with us.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've had a nightmare with the connection.
No, it's absolutely fine, Richard. And I'm a bit cognizant on time, so I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions before we finish. I mean, from your perspective, we've heard both from Gary and Paul, but from your perspective, what are the highest risk routes of this disease entering into farms, and what you're seeing out there in the field?
Yeah, well, Paul's already covered it very well. So rodents, absolutely, and yeah, we know the historic links. We've known for ages the link between salmonella and rodents. As Paul has said, the recently found some positive mice, no indication that they were actively infected or any internal contamination, but it was certainly on their fur and feet. So they're acting as a fomite and potentially can take virus directly in through the smallest holes. We've also heard about rainwater ingress. We have still a number of infected premises where there's evidence of water ingress. Paul's mentioned cases or infected birds first appearing near doorways, which certainly is the case, but we've also had them where the first clinically infected birds have actually been noticed under an area where there is leakage and water coming in through the roof or down the walls. So integrity of the buildings is key. Again, fully support the whole thing about having a really effective hygiene barrier, ideally changing boots and overalls from outside to in, so they're completely separate. Nothing worn outside goes inside. And then for those systems where they need to use it, bedding management we certainly see that consistently coming up as a risk factor or a potential risk factor for taking virus into the sheds, particularly if the bedding's stored outside. Ideally, it should be stored inside prior to placement of the birds. If it has to be stored outside, stay on wrapped pallets. Absolutely crucial when you remove the outer wrapping. If there's any damage to the bales, they are disregarded, they're discarded, they're not used. And again, disinfecting the inner wrapper before carrying those inside. Otherwise, potentially that's a route of bypassing any of the other biosecurity measures. I think that's probably my main points.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. I mean, from an epidemiology point of view, how is the avian influenza virus changing, and why has it caused more problems primarily with the turkeys and the ducks?
I don't personally think it's changing per se. We've consistently seen problems with turkeys over the last few seasons. I mean, galliform birds, so chickens and turkeys, are particularly susceptible. I would say turkeys probably the most susceptible. And if disease gets in, we can see it rapidly going through the shed in a matter of days. We can have whole sheds with most of the birds dead over the period of 2 or 3 days. We're looking at a very short incubation period for this virus. Once it gets into a bird, it only takes one bird to be infected. So a tiny amount of virus taken in by the bird. That bird will then amplify the virus, pass it on to others, and it rapidly spreads. If I'd been able to use my slides, there's an example of disease in chickens. That was a laying flock, but you can see the exponential increase. So from a background level of mortalities of possibly 1 or 2 a day to 4, then to 8, then up to 20, and then you get into the hundreds and thousands very, very rapidly literally over 48, 72 hours. We have seen clinical signs also in other sectors. So ducks, we've seen them, but we don't tend to get quite the expression in those sectors unless it's day old or very young ducklings that have been placed. We've had a couple of cases where the ducklings were placed and they went down by about 7 days after placement. No indication, no problems, no links or concerns with the hatchery that those birds had been infected on site, and they rapidly went down over the course of several days.
Jack, you're on mute. Sorry, can you unmute?
Sorry, no. Yeah, just one last question for yourself, Richard, before we have to shoot this. Is, you know, the industry are looking at this widely, but what is the risk associated with co-grazing or mixed species setups with avian influenza?
The major risk with those really is, I mean, luckily so far we haven't seen what has happened in the States. They've obviously had big problems with bird flu getting into the dairy sector in particular. Recently, we've seen infection in dairy cattle in the Netherlands. They showed antibody production. There was no signs of infection with those. Obviously, the virus in the States is a different strain to the one that we have. So far, we've had one case a couple of years ago where we had a positive in a sheep. We detected virus in the udder of the sheep. It was lactating sheep, recently lambed. The major risks really are, it's essentially increasing footfall. And if you've got mixing, ideally we want, if you do have a mixed enterprise, we'd want, as far as possible, separate staff looking after the mammals versus the birds, no sharing of equipment. Whenever we have co-located mammals on an infected premises, well, historically we've always had to test pigs. That's a legal requirement, but nothing new in that. But since developments in the States, we have now been doing testing of mammals. The field epi team does an epidemiological assessment of whether there are any potential risky links between the mammals and the birds. If we can't rule out direct or indirect contact by whatever mechanism, equipment, people, etc., then the mammals will be sampled. To date, this season, so from 1st of October, we've already sampled about 250 mammals. So that's pigs, as we normally would. We're also a number of cattle, sheep, some goats, some alpacas, some horses and donkeys, 7 ferrets, and 2 cats. And so far this season, all of those have been negative. But it is, you know, potentially the risk of more of we want to make sure that the virus doesn't go from the birds into the mammals. There's no evidence that there's a mammalian adaptation yet, but obviously there's always a risk of that, which would be quite a serious development.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for them insights, and apologies for any technical difficulties that we've found during the webinar. This is all we have got time for today, and we appreciate the questions that have been placed in. We will feed back to yourselves when across the panel. We will get back to you on them questions, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, that is all we have time for today. So we've seen how avian influenza continues to challenge UK poultry and the meat production, and why it's so important to understand the risks, spot the patterns, and act quickly. From the latest outbreak data and seasonal trends to frontline insights and practical steps you can take away from this webinar, we've covered how disease possibly gets into sheds, where the risks lie, and how layered biosecurity measures can make all the difference. So thank you all for joining us. On the screen, you will see a QR code. Use this to book a call with Livetec team to discuss your emergency response plans and any contingency planning. We hope you found today's session insightful. Again, we apologise for any technical difficulties we have found, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. So thank you all. Goodbye.